So considering sex outside of marriage, fornication, let's take that for consideration. For instance, what would happen if everyone had sex outside of marriage? So if I'm considering having sex outside of marriage, I would ask myself, well, it's okay, or I would say that it is okay, or it's morally good for people to have sex outside of marriage. So can we universalize that principle? Can we have everybody in society do it? And what would happen if everybody in society did it? Well, if everybody in society had sex outside of marriage, then what really would be the use of marriage? I mean, if marriage is supposed to be a relationship from within which people express sexuality in a way that is exclusive, and people are engaging in sex outside of marriage, then why even have marriage? What happens to the institution of marriage? Well, the institution of marriage becomes superfluous at that point. Unless there's some other reason for it, the institution of marriage collapses in on itself because if everyone is having sex outside of marriage, then what does it mean to have sex inside of marriage? So Kant concluded, and this is one of the things that he did take up, Kant concluded that because of its deleterious effects on the institution of marriage, sex outside of marriage therefore was immoral. Because if we said that, if we told everybody to do it, and everybody followed through and did it, then marriage itself would become superfluous. What if we asked ourselves, what if we consider the activity of homosexual sex? What would happen if everybody had homosexual sex? And again, Kant here took this issue up during his day, and he said that, well, if everybody did that, then because the homosexual relationship itself sexual relationship is sterile, and because it cannot produce children, then that would involve the extinction of mankind within a generation. If everyone were to have homosexual sex, there would be no procreation. So Kant believed that effect was an indicator that homosexual sex was a bad thing. What if everyone felt free to engage in prostitution? Okay, so if I'm considering, should I go to a prostitute for sex, and then you would ask yourself, well, what if everybody went to prostitutes for sex? Well, what would happen if that happened? What might happen? Certainly, that would not have a good impact on marriages. It surely wouldn't have a good impact on families, and therefore, by the categorical imperative, it would be considered to be an immoral thing, because it would have that. If everybody did it, it would completely disrupt and destroy societal order and things like that. So that's how Kant would say that one formulation of his categorical imperative. If we ask ourselves, if everybody did it, then what would happen? And then he would take that and he would say, okay, well, what if everyone reserved sex for a monogamous marriage relationship? Well, he theorized that if everybody did that, then in fact society would be better off, because if everybody in fact did that, then we wouldn't have adultery. We wouldn't have many of the issues that would lead to the destruction and devaluation of marriage, and so that would be a great thing, according to Kant. And according to his theory, that would have a good effect on society. You could. There are no internal contradictions. You could say that everybody goes ahead and does this. And if everybody followed through on it, society would be the better off, according to his theory. There's another formulation, though, of Kant's categorical imperative, and that was treat others as ends and not means only. What if we followed this in relationship to asking whether or not asexual behavior, a particular type of sexual behavior, is a good thing, then what kind of principle do we have here? Well, basically, the principle is this: that when we're considering going into a sexual relationship with someone, that we treat that person not as a means to an end. And there are a lot of kind of sexual behavior where people are treated as a means to an end. And Kant would say what we need to do is make sure that we treat people as an end in themselves and not a means only. And so, okay, that person might be a means to an end for sexual gratification, and that very well, I mean, that happens in sex, and that's certainly the best kind of sex should involve both partners, having coming away gratified, coming away from it fulfilled, and things like that. But going into it, Kant would say, by this formulation of the categorical imperative, he would say that going into it, we need to go into it with the mindset that, look, I'm not just here for what's in it for me. I'm here to benefit my partner as well, and so I'm considering them as an end in themselves. And so my responsibility in this act is to make sure that I consider them an end as well as a means to the end of my own gratification. Are we taking the other person's sexual needs into consideration when we engage in sex? I mean, is it sort of a we hit it and quit it thing, or is it are we thinking of their needs as well? And the needs are not only the physical needs, but needs as in relational or emotional needs as well, because those things are bound up in the sex act itself also. So those things are considerations that we would need to take into consideration if we were going to treat others as an end in themselves and not a means only. So those are some deontological considerations. We could go down the list of different sex activity, and we could apply those two principles. Can we universalize it? What would happen if we said that everybody did it, and also are we treating others as an end in themselves and not just as a means to an end? Okay, the next consideration that that we might want to think about is that of natural law. Natural law is going to begin with the question of what is natural for us to do, what is evident in nature, and what factors do we need to consider to determine whether or not a certain sex activity is moral. Now, the problem with natural law, though, is that, and this is one of the major issues, and you probably read about this in one of the selections in your book. I hope you did anyway, or at least I hope you will be doing that. You'll need to in order to do the quiz, so please do look in there. But natural law is going to try to determine, okay, what part of human nature do we take into consideration when we ask the question of whether or not a particular sex act is going to be in accordance with that part of nature. And the problem is that we have to determine what part of human nature are we talking about. We need to determine what in the world is what is the nature of sexuality, and what in nature do we have to consider when we're asking the question here. For instance, we could say that the nature of human sexuality is reproduction. And if that's the case, then any act that did not eventuate in reproduction, that act would be bad. Now, one of the authors that you'll read in your book is a guy by the name of John Finnis, and he writes an article which is kind of an interesting one. And he equates the sex act, at least part of the sex act, part of the importance of the sex act is that it should have as its goal in mind reproduction, because that's why we have it. That's what it's made for. And now there might be all kinds of other things associated with it, personal gratification, emotional fulfillment, and all these things. But reproduction is one of the two primary purposes for sexuality, and so that anything that undermines the conception and raising of children is in itself immoral. So Finnis would consider birth control being an immoral thing because it does not comport with the nature of human sexuality as reproduction. Masturbation would be immoral on those terms. It would not comport with natural law. If the human nature of sexuality is reproduction, then masturbation would be out of bounds. Homosexuality would be also. But not only these things, extramarital affairs. One might say when someone commits adultery, when someone goes outside of their marriage relationship in order to have sex, they're not looking for children there. They're just looking for personal gratification. They're not looking for a closeness or a oneness with that person. They're not looking to have children, and therefore, if what it means to be moral in sex means that it's going to allow for reproduction, that person's not thinking of reproducing with whoever they're sleeping with outside of their marriage. Oral sex, sodomy, anal sex, so those are all bad things according to this view of human sexuality. If the nature of human sexuality is reproduction, then any sex act that goes against that nature would be then considered immoral. But what if we say, well, there's more to it than just having babies, right? There's more to sex than just having babies. And so the nature of human sexuality is not reproduction. What if we say that it's pleasure? What if the nature of human sexuality is pleasure? Well, basically anything that undermines pleasure and sexuality is bad, and anything that promotes it is good. And when we're considering that, keep in mind that we may not just be talking about immediate pleasure, sort of the immediate pleasure of the sex act itself, but rather what are the consequences going to be in terms of, is this sex act, if I commit it, is going to bring pleasure or is it going to bring pain? This goes back to almost a utilitarian argument. Because utilitarians say the greatest good for the greatest number, or the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number. Well, a certain sex act might bring immediate pleasure, but when we consider it in light of whether or not it's going to bring pleasure in our personal relationships, that might be different. So if you are a teenager having sex with another teenager and your parents find out about it, that's not going to be very pleasurable. If you are a person committing adultery, while that might be pleasurable in itself, if your spouse finds out about it, that's not going to end up being pleasurable. So any sort of form of sex act or that would detract from pleasure, if the essence of human sexuality or the nature of human sexuality is pleasure, then any act that is going to bring pain would in itself be immoral. But is that it? Is it just a matter of pleasure? Is it just in whose pleasure? My pleasure, my spouse's pleasure, my partner's pleasure, the pleasure of friends and family around us. What pleasure do we take in consideration there? But is human nature is the nature of human sexuality rather strictly about pleasure? Well, there's a pleasure in it, but there are also other things attached to it as well. One could say that the nature of human sexuality is relational oneness, and so anything in the sex act that would promote relational oneness, that would be good, and that sex act would be good, and anything that detracts from the sex, or anything in the sex act that would detract from relational oneness, would be an immoral sex act. Rape, lying, and manipulation, when they're involved in the sex act, those things would be bad because they do not go for relational oneness. Masturbation would be bad because that is a inherently selfish act. It's not you're not relating to somebody at that point. But anything goes pretty much if it's between consensual partners and they want to relate to one another, and if the nature of human sexuality is relational oneness, then it would be judged on that basis. And then there are some who will say, well, it's none of those. We need to ask ourselves, we need to take into consideration because relational oneness, that's a subjective thing, right? Relational oneness is not something that you can put in a measuring cup and measure it. And you can't measure it with a ruler or something like that. It's something that is very subjective. And so how do you measure that? How do you in order to determine whether or not that act is good or bad? Well, you can't really. And the same thing really goes with pleasure. Is pleasure and pain, those are very subjective things. They're very, I judge them on the basis of what I think, rather than being able to measure them. So how do you do that? How do you measure those things? The nature of human sexuality is reproduction. That would be a measurable thing, but not always. What if a person is sterile? What if a person can't have children? And then does that mean that every sex act that they engage in is inherently a bad sex act because they can't reproduce? So there are those who would argue from nature then, well, nature is none of those things. Nature, rather, is what we when determining whether or not a sex act is moral, and we want to use nature as the law. What we need to do is consider strictly anatomical factors. So the anatomy of a person's human sexual response. The anatomy gives clues as to what sex should be used for. So when determining whether or not a particular sex act is moral or not moral, we need to consider the human body, for instance.